vested interest in trying to figure out how to predict and understand these dangerous weather patterns, instead of just sitting back and being taken by surprise time and again. The most prominent of these Cuban researchers was Father Benito Vines, who, upon taking over the Bellin Observatory in Havana, dedicated his life to discovering the various signs that indicated a hurricane was coming. Among Father Benito's most notable accomplishments was the discovery that high veils of cirrus clouds that resembled the tail feathers of a rooster were a sure sign that a hurricane was coming. So, to watch out for these and other signs, Father Benito set up a network of observers and messengers who would carry a warning to the rest of the island if they saw anything. The US, though, as a result of the Spanish-American War, would take over control of Cuba, and the nation's Weather Bureau would establish one of their own hurricane monitoring outposts on the island. That being said, instead of working in conjunction with the Cubans and the Bellin Observatory, the Willis-Moore-controlled Weather Bureau looked down their noses at the Cubans who dedicated themselves to studying hurricanes. There were multiple reasons for this attitude. Partially it was due to the fact that Moore wanted full control of weather forecasting in and around the US, and thus he didn't want any competition whatsoever. Moore also could not even begin to deal with the prospect that some other service might actually be better at some type of weather forecasting than his own bureau. Plus, there was also a bit of colonialism/racism baked into this situation as well, because why wouldn't there be? For example, the Weather Bureau's manager on the island, one William B. Stockman, saw the people of Cuba as primitives who needed to be guided by the clearly superior Americans. Stockman then was dismissive of the island's long history of accomplishments when it came to studying and predicting hurricanes. In Stockman's opinions, the Cubans were simply too easily panicked, so it was his and the Bureau's responsibility to avoid creating, quote, unnecessary alarm among the natives. On top of that, Stockman was also convinced that the Cubans were trying to steal the American Weather Bureau's observations in an attempt to improve their own forecasts, an idea that seems strange in today's world where weather observations and the like are pretty freely shared. At this time, though, weather forecasting was treated very much like a competition between the various different national weather services, so the idea of sharing information for the common good was not really a factor. Instead, governments and their agencies were intensely protective of their weather observations. So, to try and silence the competition, Moore, through his ally Colonel Dunwoody, who was his chief liaison on Cuba, worked together to convince the U.S. War Department in 1900, as they were still in charge of Cuba, to ban the Cuban forecasters from using the government's telegraphs. Basically, Moore made it so the only officials on the island who could send telegrams about the weather were the men from his own Weather Bureau. Now, the government weren't the only ones with a telegraph system connecting the island to the mainland, as Western Union also provided such a service. Moore, though, managed to convince the Secretary of Agriculture to contact the President of the Western Union, writing, quote, the United States Weather Bureau in Cuba has been greatly annoyed by independent observatories securing a few scattered reports and then attempting to make weather predictions and issue hurricane warnings to the detriment of commerce and the embarrassment of the government service. A communication in which we see another reason why the Weather Bureau didn't want to use terms like hurricane and tornado if at all possible, because such a warning might, negatively affect commerce. This message then had the intended effect, as the Western Union instituted a similar ban, which effectively prevented the Cubans from sharing their hurricane predictions with the rest of the world. Now, understandably, the Cubans were not what you would call happy about this ban, which actually caught Stockman and the Americans by surprise, as they apparently just expected the Cubans to accept it as just kind of the way things were now. Yet, instead of this unthinking compliance, the Cubans were outraged to be treated in such a manner. Plus, they also saw this as a disservice to the numerous people who relied upon the opinions and observations of their hurricane experts. This ban, in fact, would prove especially costly for the people of Galveston, as the storm that would ultimately drown their city arrived in Cuba a week earlier on the 1st of September, a storm that was met by two very different reactions from the American observers and their Cuban counterparts. For Stockman and the other American Weather Bureau observers, the storm that rolled over Cuba wasn't of much note, as Stockman would describe it as a, quote, storm of moderate intensity. You'll also note that in this official communication, he simply referred to it as a storm and not a hurricane. In contrast, the Cubans working for the Bellin Observatory showed no hesitation in labeling the storm a hurricane, which to Stockton was only more proof of why they needed to be banned from using the telegraph, as they were only going to cause a useless panic. Indeed, this was one of the main justifications that Stockman would use when on Wednesday the 5th of September, Dunwoody encouraged him to compose a defense for their having the Cubans banned from using the telegraph. Half of Stockman's defense, in fact, would be dedicated to the storm that had just passed over Cuba, a storm that had not done much of note, but one that the Cubans had been calling a cyclone since the end of August and had recently declared a hurricane. A storm that, while it dropped a large amount of rain, was surely no such thing because, quote, no dangerous winds are indicated. According to Stockman, then, these quote-unquote native Cubans weren't proper scientists like the white Americans working for the Weather Bureau. These Cubans saw hurricanes everywhere and were likely to cause a panic with their undisciplined predictions, and thus they should not be allowed to use the telegraph to spread their misinformation. Yet Father Gangoit of the Bellon Observatory, despite the Americans' doubts, could not ignore the signs that this storm was becoming a monster. You see, for those who looked, there was a large and persistent halo around the moon. Such a halo was a manifestation of the high thin clouds that Cuban observers had long ago recognized as signs of a hurricane. Now, to be fair, describing it as a storm of moderate intensity was a fairly accurate measure of the status of the hurricane at that time, so the American Weather Bureau observers were simply reporting on where the storm stood in that moment, which wasn't particularly impressive or dangerous. That being said, the Cubans, who had much more experience in dealing with hurricanes, were able to look at this information and predict that while the storm wasn't particularly dangerous currently, it had the potential to become significantly worse. In fact, Father Gangoit, as the current director of Havana's Bellon Observatory, in their September 1st report would note that while the storm was small, it was the type historically that after dropping large amounts of rain on the island, goes on to strengthen rapidly. This warning about the nature of this storm, though, would be both silenced and ignored by the Willis Moore-led Weather Bureau. Worse still, as the storm moved on past Cuba, Moore and the others in the Bureau were convinced that by the 5th of September, it had shown signs of turning to the north. You see, as they understood it, hurricanes, once they started to curve in the manner they observed the storm doing, they continued to do so, meaning that the storm's path would take it into Florida and then northeast into the Atlantic. The Weather Bureau then predicted that the storm would, quote, probably will be felt as far north as Norfolk by Thursday night, and is likely to extend over the middle Atlantic and South New England states by Friday. The thing was, there really wasn't any data from the storm that supported this belief. Indeed, they were so sure of themselves and their predictions that no one seemingly took note of the actual behavior of the storm, as instead of taking the expected path, the hurricane was influenced by the high-pressure zones that were in place over Florida at the time. As a result, instead of curving up to the northeast and into the Atlantic, the storm took a hard left into the Gulf, which, as we will see, was abnormally warm that year. Granted, they had nothing like satellites and radar to track hurricanes with. Even ship-to-shore communication was new, having only been invented a few years earlier, so the ships that had the unfortunate luck to plow into the storm were unequipped with such technology, and thus they were unable to provide any warning to places along the Gulf Coast that lay in the storm's path. Still, there were signs that the Weather Bureau missed that should have told them it was not taking the path they assumed it was. Most notably, on the 5th of September in Key West, Florida, the gale winds coming from the northeast weakened and then shifted to the south before strengthening from that direction. This, according to Professor of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science Carrie Emanuel, meant that the storm center had passed by to the southwest before heading in a northwesterly direction, something they would have understood at the time had they not been so convinced that the storm that had passed over Cuba was heading to the northeast. Unlike the Americans, though, for the Cubans working at the Bellon Observatory, this was not a minor storm that was turning to the northeast and heading into the Atlantic. As from reading the movements of the high clouds that they knew were signs of a hurricane, they recognized that this particular storm was moving in a northwesterly direction. The belief then among the Cuban scientists was the storm was headed for Texas. The head of the U.S. Weather Bureau's office in Galveston, Texas was a man by the name of Isaac Klein. Both Isaac and his younger brother Joseph, who would also find himself working in the Galveston branch of the Weather Bureau when the storm hit, grew up on a farm in Monroe County, Tennessee, where at one point while he was in high school, a friend of Isaac's would encourage him to become a preacher, knowing of his love for the Bible. Also, during these formative years, Isaac thought of joining some of his other friends and becoming a lawyer. The thing was, Isaac had grown up loving science, and he even dreamed of writing a scientific treatise that would have an impact on the world. So, instead of joining the priesthood, Isaac enrolled at Hiawassee College, where he studied Latin, Greek, mathematics, physics, and chemistry. It was then through this time studying at Hiawassee College that Isaac would first become involved in the study of the weather. Now, to be clear, the young man doesn't seem to have taken any classes there on the subject. Instead, his involvement was the result of the college's president J.H. Bruner recommending him to the head of the U.S. Signal Corps at the time, General William B. Hazen. You see, Hazen was looking to recruit good, upstanding, scientifically minded men to join the country's new weather service. To that end, the general reached out to college presidents all across the country, asking for their recommendations for fitting candidates from their graduating classes. The 20-year-old Isaac, upon accepting this offer, would in July 1882 be ordered to report to Fort Myer, which sat across the river from Washington, D.C. Now, the Weather Bureau that young Isaac joined was still very much focused on things like conducting cavalry drills, something which Isaac didn't seem to have a problem with, and if anything, he was said to have been quite proud of the cavalry saber he was issued upon joining the Signal Corps. He even took to his cavalry training quite well, as he was already a skilled horseman thanks to his days growing up in Tennessee's back country. In addition to training to take part in cavalry charges, Isaac was also taught some more useful-seeming skills like how to take apart and rebuild a telegraph transmitter, as well as how to climb a pole and string a telegraph wire. Which again may sound unconnected to the job of observing and predicting the weather, but the telegraph was of vital importance as for the first time in history, it allowed for the rapid transmission of weather observations from thousands of miles away. Now, how useful this knowledge ever proved to be, as they typically seem to rely on telegraph services, I can't say, but at least there's more of a connection there than learning how to take part in a cavalry charge. Once Isaac was done with his training, he, like all the other Weather Bureau recruits, would be tested to determine where they would be assigned and what type of job they would be given. Isaac Klein would finish 16th out of his class and would be assigned to the Weather Bureau office in Little Rock, Arkansas. There he was responsible for making weather observations at 5 in the morning and at 11 at night. In between these assigned duties, Isaac was responsible for collecting the weather dispatches that were telegraphed by railroad agents, and to then use those to put together bulletins that would be provided to the weather station's customers. As for the scientific pursuit that Isaac, like all Weather Bureau agents, were supposed to pursue, he took advantage of the fact that the University of Arkansas's medical school was located just 3 blocks away from his weather station. So Isaac decided to study how the weather and the climate affected people medically. In fact, since Isaac's schedule at the weather station left him with ample time to take classes, he enrolled at the medical school in 1882 and graduated in March of 1885. With his medical degree in hand, Isaac was then ordered by General Hazen to go take charge of the weather station in Fort Concho, Texas. What Isaac didn't know upon first receiving this assignment, but what he would realize quite quickly, was the part of Texas he had been assigned to was quite a bit more wild and untamed than Little Rock had been. In fact, in Little Rock, the 23-year-old Isaac had become quite a bit of a fancy boy or a dandy, as was the parlance of the time, as he was known to go about town wearing a silk top hat, kid gloves, a Prince Albert Brown beaver suit, all while carrying a cane despite not actually needing one. Little Rock then was the kind of town where people were expected to walk around in such finery. In contrast, the part of Texas where Fort Concho lay was kind of on the frontier. It was a kind of Wild West type of area. The type of area, in fact, where shortly before Isaac's arrival, Judge Roy Bean from a saloon courtroom declared that a group of drunk cowboys who had gunned down half a dozen Chinese railroad workers could not in fact be charged with murder because, quote, "I've examined the laws of the United States carefully, and I do not find any law which says that a white man shall be punished for killing a Chinaman." Soon enough, though, the weather station would be moved from Fort Concho to the relatively nearby city of Abilene. Now, Abilene at the time was still a far cry from the type of place that Isaac was used to, yet it would be a place where he would find love in the form of the young organist of the Baptist church that Isaac attended in the city. Describing her as, quote, "beautiful, brilliant, and cultured," Isaac fell head over heels for Cora May Bellew, the niece of the church's pastor. Indeed, by March 1887, the pair was wed, and by December of that year, just 8.5 months after their wedding, the pair had their first daughter, Allie Mae. 2 years later, in 1889, the now 27-year-old Isaac was ordered to take over the weather station in Galveston. This, by the way, was during the time when inspectors were going around and checking in on the various stations around the country. Inspectors who had apparently found the station in Galveston extremely wanting, as, among other things, the inspector, upon arriving in Galveston, had to actually clean the station's barometer to actually get a reading from it, suggesting that those who had been manning the station likely hadn't taken an actual reading in some time. In contrast, Isaac was exactly the type of man with exactly the kind of record that the Signal Corps was looking for, as it hoped to salvage the Weather Bureau's questionable reputation. Indeed, Isaac would quickly turn Galveston's weather station into a